Elvis was found on the bathroom floor at Graceland, alone, face down, arms tucked under him, as he'd just knelt to pray. For years, the people around him knew exactly why. They just never said it. Not the doctor, not the bodyguards, not even his own wife. Today, that silence finally breaks. The house call that never ended. The phone rang inside a Memphis clinic in 1967. A young doctor named George Nicopolis picked it up. Someone needed him at a house on Highway 51. Fast. He grabbed his bag and drove over. He had no idea whose house it was. The gates opened, the driveway curved up toward a mansion, and there, waiting for him, was Elvis Presley. Nicopolis had seen plenty of patients by then. He hadn't seen anything like this. Guitars leaned against the walls, gold records lined the hallway, and in the middle of it stood the biggest star in the world, complaining about a sore back. The doctor treated him, wrote a prescription, left. He figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Elvis called again a few weeks later. Then again. Insomnia, mostly. Aches from years of karate training and stage performances that left his body wrecked by the time he was 30. Nicopolis kept coming back, kept treating him. And somewhere in those visits, something shifted. By 1970, Elvis had moved back to Memphis full-time. And Nicopolis wasn't just his doctor anymore. He was in the entourage, on the plane, in the room. At 4 in the morning, when Elvis couldn't sleep and needed someone to talk to. Friends started calling him Dr. Nick. The name stuck for the rest of his life. Years later, a reporter asked him a simple question. What were you to Elvis, really? He didn't say physician. He said something else entirely. I was one of his closest friends, Nicopolis said. At times, I was his father, his best friend, his doctor. Whatever role I needed to play at the time, I did. Think about that for a second. A doctor describing his patient and reaching for the word father before he reached for the word patient. That single sentence explains almost everything that came after it. Because once a doctor becomes family, the rules change. You don't say no to family the same way you say no to a patient. You don't walk away. You stay close, even when staying close starts to cost you something. And it did cost him. It cost him more than he probably understood at the time. Elvis's relationship with medication didn't start with Dr. Nick. It started years earlier in the United States Army, when Elvis was handed amphetamines to stay alert during long stretches of duty. That was normal back then. Soldiers all over the country were doing it. Nobody blinked. But amphetamines keep you awake, and Elvis needed to sleep eventually. So he started taking something to bring himself back down at night. Up in the morning, down at night. That was the rhythm. And it followed him out of the Army and straight into stardom. By the time Dr. Nick became his full-time physician, that rhythm wasn't a habit anymore. It was a system, a structure holding up his entire daily life. Here's where it gets hard to hear. Between 1975 and 1977, records later showed that Dr. Nick had prescribed close to 19,000 doses of medication for Elvis. Not over a decade, over roughly 2.5 years. In just the first 8 months of 1977 alone, more than 10,000 of those doses went to him. Do the math on that. It comes out to somewhere around 20 pills a day, every day, for years. Stimulants to get him up and moving before a show. Sedatives to bring him down afterwards so he could sleep. And other medications woven in between, just to keep his body functioning through the gaps. Dr. Nick later admitted he traveled everywhere with 3 full suitcases of medical supplies. Not painkillers for a headache. A mobile pharmacy built specifically so Elvis's team never had to walk him into a hospital before a show. None of this reached the public. Not really. Elvis's family understood how damaging the story would be if it ever got out. So they worked to keep it buried. When reporters occasionally pushed, asking pointed questions about his health, his energy, the changes in his body, they were met with stage press conferences, carefully worded statements, denial dressed up as reassurance. For the fans in the arena seats screaming his name, none of it was visible. They saw the jumpsuit, the scarf, the voice that still, even in decline, could stop a room cold. They had no idea what was happening behind the curtain in the hours before doors opened, when a man who could barely get out of bed some mornings was being built back up, piece by piece, just to walk on stage one more time. And at the center of that machine stood one man with a medical license and a friendship that had gone somewhere neither of them expected it to go. That friendship would end up costing Dr. Nick almost everything: his reputation, his license. Decades of his life spent explaining, defending, and re-explaining what really happened behind those gates. But that part of the story comes later. Right now, none of that has happened yet. Right now, it's just a young doctor, a famous patient, and a friendship neither one of them can see the shape of yet. 20 pills. A day. By August of 1977, Elvis was found unresponsive on his bathroom floor at Graceland. He was 42. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat. But the toxicology report told a different, messier story. At least 10 different prescription substances were found in his system: codeine, quaaludes, at levels doctors later called significant. Dr. Nick signed the death certificate that day. Some fans never forgave him for it. In their eyes, every prescription he'd written over the past decade had been another small step toward that bathroom floor. But ask Dr. Nick why he kept writing them, and his answer wasn't the one people expected. He said Elvis genuinely didn't see the problem, not because he was in denial, because of where the pills came from. Elvis's problem was that he didn't see the wrong in it, Dr. Nick explained years later. He felt that by getting it from a doctor, he wasn't the common everyday junkie getting something off the street. The prescription bottle looked clean, legal, safe, nothing like a deal made in an alley somewhere. Dr. Nick claimed he tried to fight back against it, quietly, in his own way. According to his own account, he manufactured close to 1,000 fake pills. Placebos. No real medication inside them at all. He'd swap them in whenever he thought he could get away with it, hoping Elvis wouldn't notice the difference. His reasoning was simple, even if it's hard to accept. If he cut Elvis off completely, Elvis wouldn't just stop. He'd find another doctor. Or worse, he'd turn to the street, buying from people with no license and no restraint at all. Staying close, even while enabling him, felt like the safer option. At least that way, someone who cared about him still had a hand on the wheel. Whether that reasoning holds up is something people still argue about today. But it's the answer Dr. Nick gave, over and over, for the rest of his life. 3 years after Elvis died, in 1980, Dr. Nick was indicted, 14 counts. Overprescribing stimulants, depressants, and painkillers, not just to Elvis, but to other patients too, including musician Jerry Lee Lewis. The trial came in 1981. Dr. Nick took the stand in his own defense. He told the court he genuinely tried to manage his patients' intake, steering them away from the street rather than feeding a habit. The jury acquitted him on every count. But that wasn't the end of it. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners ran its own investigation, separate from the criminal case, and reached a different conclusion. They found he had, in fact, overprescribed medication for years. His license was suspended for 3 months. He was placed on 3 years of probation. Then, in 1993, more than 15 years after Elvis's death, the board went further. They revoked his license permanently, not because of one famous patient, because the pattern showed up again and again, across numerous patients, over many years. The press gave him a name that followed him for the rest of his life: Dr. Feelgood. Even decades later, Dr. Nick never fully backed down. In a 2010 interview, he said plainly, "To my knowledge, the amount of prescription medications Elvis took had nothing to do with his death." He held that position until he died in 2016, at 88 years old. Shortly before his death, he offered one more explanation, a strange one. He claimed Elvis's real underlying problem had been severe chronic constipation, something Elvis was deeply embarrassed by, embarrassed enough to avoid the corrective surgery that might have actually helped him. Dr. Nick believed that condition, more than anything else, explained the weight gain and physical decline in Elvis's final years. He believed a simple procedure, agreed to sooner, might have kept him alive far longer. You can believe that or not, but one thing about it is undeniable. Nobody outside Elvis's inner circle knew any of this while he was alive. Not the extent of it, not the numbers, not the suitcases of medical supplies traveling from city to city, show to show. His doctor, by his own description one of his closest friends, spent the rest of his life explaining, defending and occasionally revising the story of what really happened behind the walls of Graceland. Dr. Nick wasn't a stranger exploiting a famous name for money. He was a man who genuinely seemed to care about Elvis, who stayed close through years most people would have walked away from, and who still, by his own admission, kept the prescriptions flowing right up until the very end. Loyalty and harm, it turns out, aren't always opposites. Sometimes they come from the exact same person, at the exact same time. And he wasn't the only one who saw it happening. He wasn't even the first person close to Elvis to try warning the world about it. That warning came from somewhere else entirely, from two men who had known Elvis since they were teenagers, long before the fame, long before the pills, long before any of it started. They tried to say something too, and when they finally did, it nearly buried Elvis's legacy before the world had a chance to understand why they had said it at all. The men who got fired. First, Red West grew up down the street from Elvis in Memphis. They were teenagers together, poor kids in a poor part of town, long before anyone knew the name Presley would mean anything. His cousin Sonny West came up the same way, close to Elvis, close to the family. Not hired help brought in from the outside. Real friends from the very beginning. By the time Elvis became the biggest star on the planet, Red and Sonny were still there. Only now, their job had a title. Bodyguards, protecting him at concerts, traveling with him, living inside the tight circle of friends and employees that surrounded Elvis everywhere he went, a group people started calling the Memphis Mafia. A third man, Dave Hebler, joined that same security detail later on. For years, these three men stood physically closer to Elvis than almost anyone else alive. Then, in July of 1976, all three were fired, at once. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, handled the family's money, and he made the call. Officially, it was framed as a cost-cutting decision, nothing personal, just business. But for men who'd given years of their lives, often for very little pay, protecting someone they considered family, it didn't feel like business. It felt like betrayal. So, they decided to talk. Working with journalist Steve Dunleavy, Red Sonny, and Dave put together a book. They called it Elvis, What Happened? And inside it, they described things about Elvis's life that had never once been made public. The prescription substance use, the pattern nobody outside the inner circle had seen. One story, particularly disturbing, involved a young woman Elvis had met one night in Las Vegas, who later nearly died after a night involving dangerous medication at his Palm Springs home. Red West didn't soften any of it. His system doesn't work anymore like a normal human being's, he wrote. Sonny added his own warning, one that reads almost like a prophecy now. He said there was a whole sickness thing that is going to happen to him. The book hit shelves in the United States in July 1977. 2 weeks later, on August 16th, Elvis was dead. The timing turned the book into something the authors never fully controlled. It sold more than 3 million copies. One of the best-selling books ever written about him. But that success came at a cost none of them expected either. Fans were furious. To them, Red Sonny and Dave hadn't tried to save Elvis. They'd cashed in on him, betrayed him for a payday right as his life was falling apart. Some called them leeches. Others accused them outright of profiting from his decline. Sonny West spent years pushing back against that version of events. If you read the book, you would find out it's not the substance thing that sticks out, he said in one interview. It's the things we did crazy, the good times, the things we had, and how we felt the substances changed him into the person he became. In his mind, and in Red's, the book wasn't written as an attack. It was closer to a desperate plea, one last attempt, dressed up as the only tool 2 fired bodyguards had left, to shake Elvis into seeing what was happening to him before it was too late. It's worth remembering what these 2 men had actually given up over the years, long before any of this. They'd put themselves in real physical danger for him, more than once. Worked long hours for little pay, sometimes for nothing, beyond the gifts Elvis handed out personally, cars, jewelry, his own private way of saying thank you for their loyalty. Whatever their reasons for writing the book, they weren't outsiders exploiting a celebrity they barely knew. They were 2 of the people who had spent the most time standing physically next to him for nearly 20 years straight. But not everyone close to Elvis agreed the book was worth writing at all. His own stepbrother, David Stanley, spoke publicly years later about the real damage the book caused in the final days of Elvis's life specifically, and he revealed something most people still don't know. Elvis had read the manuscript months before the public ever did. The finished book hit stores just 10 days before he died. But according to Stanley, Elvis had been sitting with an early copy, reading it privately, for about 6 months before that. Reading those pages, according to Stanley, tore Elvis apart. Seeing his own private struggles laid out in black and white, written by men he'd trusted completely for most of his life, hit him in a way nothing else had. The book didn't just happen to arrive right before Elvis's death by coincidence. Not entirely. He'd been carrying the weight of what was coming and what it said about him for half a year before the rest of the world ever turned a single page. That wasn't the only thing being kept from him, though. There was another secret, tied not to substances and not to loyalty, but to something far simpler: money. And the one man controlling nearly all of it. The man who owed more than Elvis. He wasn't a colonel. He wasn't even really named Tom Parker. The man everyone called the Colonel was born in the Netherlands and had entered the United States illegally decades earlier, a fact he buried for his entire life. Historians only pieced it together well after he was gone. To the public, none of that mattered. He was simply the sharp-talking promoter who'd found a young singer in Memphis and turned him into the biggest star the world had ever seen. Elvis called him the Colonel, too, and trusted him with nearly everything. That trust came at a price few people understood at the time. From early in Elvis's career, Parker negotiated himself an extraordinary cut of everything Elvis earned, as much as 50%, an arrangement almost unheard of anywhere else in the industry. By the end, officials in Tennessee who later reviewed his finances found Parker was pocketing something closer to 80% of Elvis's income, once every side deal and arrangement was accounted for. Merchandising, film contracts, and eventually the punishing Las Vegas performance schedule that would come to define and drain the final years of Elvis's life. Here's where the story gets darker. Parker had a serious gambling addiction. Few people outside his closest circle understood how bad it really was. He was known to lose over $1 million in a single night at the tables. By the time Elvis died, Parker reportedly owed the Hilton Hotel Group in Las Vegas something close to $30 million in gambling debts. According to research done after his death, Parker had quietly worked out a private deal with the casino. Keep Elvis performing there, night after night, year after year, and the hotel would forgive Parker's own debts, extend him essentially unlimited credit at the tables in exchange. Elvis had no idea this arrangement even existed. All he knew was that his manager kept booking him for exhausting stretches of Las Vegas shows, long past the point where Elvis wanted something different. He'd expressed a desire more than once to tour internationally instead, only to be talked out of it again and again by the same man quietly using his career to cover a debt Elvis never knew he was paying off. When Elvis eventually found out what was really going on, the depth of Parker's financial entanglement with the very venue running him into the ground, he tried to fire him. It didn't happen the way people sometimes picture it. No dramatic scene on stage in front of a crowd. According to biographer Alana Nash, the real confrontation happened backstage in Las Vegas in 1974. Both men discussed ending the arrangement. Parker's response was to hand the Presley family a massive invoice. Decades of work and expenses, tallied up into an amount so large that paying it off and walking away simply wasn't realistic. So, they didn't walk away. Elvis and Parker went back to business as usual. The same arrangement stayed in place right up until Elvis's death 3 years later. The fallout outlived him. In 1981, 4 years after Elvis died, his estate sued Parker for fraud, collusion, conspiracy. Years of alleged mismanagement laid out in a courtroom. Parker countersued. The case eventually settled outside of court rather than going to trial. Parker was evicted from his longtime suite at the Hilton in 1984, once his relationship with the hotel finally soured for good. He outlived Elvis by 20 years, dying in 1997 after a stroke. Despite earning well over $100 million managing one single client across 2 decades, Parker's own estate was worth barely $1 million by the time he died. Most of it, by all accounts, gambled away over the years. Late in his life, someone finally asked him directly, "Did you exploit Elvis?" His answer managed to be a denial and an admission at the exact same time. "I don't think I exploited Elvis," he said. as much as he's being exploited today. It was the closest he ever came to admitting the truth. The relationship at the center of Elvis's entire career had never been equal. The king of rock and roll, for all his fame and fortune, had spent his career answering to a man who was quietly managing his own debts and his own secrets, right alongside him the entire time. Money wasn't the only thing being hidden from Elvis, though. Some of what shaped him ran even deeper than a bad contract or a gambling debt. It went back further than Las Vegas, further than fame itself, back to a woman named Gladys, and a loss Elvis never really recovered from: the mother. He never stopped grieving Elvis had actually been a twin. His brother, Jesse Garon Presley, was stillborn. From that moment, his mother Gladys poured everything she had into her one surviving son. She rarely let him out of her sight as a child, and Elvis in return adored her completely. He called her Satinin. Once the money started coming in, he did everything he could to give her a life of comfort, a pink Cadillac, a room at Graceland, right alongside the rest of the family. But fame, which gave Gladys everything materially, seemed to take something from her at the exact same time. She never fully adjusted to being the mother of the most famous man in America. Neighbors around Graceland reportedly mocked her for still hanging laundry outside instead of using a machine, for keeping chickens on the lawn of a mansion. "I wish we was poor again, I really do," she told a friend once over the phone. To her own cousin, she admitted something even heavier. She felt like the most miserable woman on earth. Isolated in a life she never fully wanted, Gladys started drinking more. She began taking diet pills to cope, a detail that, looking back, sits uncomfortably close to the exact pattern her son would fall into himself years later. By the summer of 1958, Gladys had developed hepatitis. Her health was failing fast. Elvis was away completing his army service at the time, stationed at Fort Hood, when word reached him that his mother had fallen seriously ill. He was granted emergency leave and rushed straight to her bedside. Her doctor, Charles Clark, described her plainly. "A desperately ill woman," he said. "Jaundice, clear signs of severe liver damage." Just days after Elvis arrived, Gladys died of a heart attack. She was 46. Elvis was inconsolable. According to reports from that day, he sank to his knees beside her hospital bed and wept. "It broke my heart," he said afterward. "She was always my best girl." At her funeral, people close to him said he could barely stand upright, let alone walk, as they lowered her into the ground. He later had her gravestone inscribed with the words, "Not mine, but her will be done." Lamar Fike, one of Elvis's closest friends and a longtime member of his inner circle, spoke about that loss years later and what it did to him. Fike didn't see it as one sad chapter in a long story. He saw it as the thing that explained almost everything that came after. Basically, Elvis's personality was that of Gladys's, Fike said. There wasn't a dime's worth of difference between them. According to Fike, the bond between mother and son had been so consuming, so central to who Elvis was, that losing her didn't just hurt him. It changed the direction of the rest of his life. Other friends noticed the same shift, each in their own way. Something in Elvis changed permanently after 1958. He never fully processed the loss the way the people around him hoped he eventually would. Some biographers who studied the relationship closely, including author Elaine Dundee in her book Elvis and Gladys, went further still. They argued Gladys's death planted the seeds for the dependency and the self-destructive patterns that would come to define his final 2 decades. There's one detail in all of this that even the people closest to Elvis found hard to shake once they sat with it. Gladys died on August 14, 1958, and was buried 2 days later. Elvis died on August 16, 1977, the exact same calendar date his mother had been laid to rest 19 years earlier. Nobody close to him ever offered a tidy explanation for that. None of his friends claimed it meant anything beyond coincidence. But for the people who'd spent years watching Elvis carry his mother's memory with him everywhere, who'd heard him talk about her decades after she was gone, as if the wound had never fully closed, the date felt like something more than chance. A strange, quiet echo of a loss he never truly recovered from. That kind of grief doesn't stay contained to one part of a life. It follows a person into every room they walk into afterward, into every relationship they try to build, including the one Elvis built with the woman he would eventually marry and that marriage held its own secret, one she wouldn't speak about publicly for decades. The mailbox. In Palm Springs. Priscilla met Elvis when she was just 14 years old. They married in 1967, when she was 21. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. The king of rock and roll and his beautiful young wife living together behind the gates of Graceland. Priscilla has since made clear, in her own words, that the reality behind those gates was far more complicated than anything fans could see. As Elvis's career shifted back toward regular performances in Las Vegas, the couple kept a second home in Palm Springs. While he was away performing, Priscilla would sometimes drive over to check on the house herself, make sure everything was clean, in order, ready for him to come home to. During one of those visits, she went to collect the mail. What she found inside disturbed her. Letters, again and again, from other women. "I'm reading the mail, and the things that I was reading I really disapproved of and didn't like," Priscilla recalled. They would go and meet Elvis at the house on weekends when he went, and it was another life. She wasn't naive about it, and by the time she spoke about it publicly, she wasn't quiet about it either. She described how Elvis would come home from those weekends and seem completely normal, great and wonderful, in her words. Still behaving like a devoted husband, despite what she now knew was happening on the other end of those visits. "He was still a good husband," she said, "but it was just too many of us." That phrase carries more weight than it first seems to. Priscilla wasn't describing one affair. She was describing a pattern. An entire second life Elvis maintained alongside the one she lived with him at Graceland, a life she became aware of piece by piece over years of marriage. Priscilla and Elvis divorced in 1973 after reports surfaced that she herself had grown close to Mike Stone, Elvis's own karate instructor, during a period when the marriage was already badly strained. Despite the divorce, and despite everything she later revealed about their years together, Priscilla has said again and again that she never stopped caring for him. Even decades after his death in 1977, she has called him the love of my life. It's a complicated kind of honesty. She wasn't interested in tearing Elvis down publicly for years after he died, but as she got older, and particularly while promoting her memoir at the age of 80, she became willing to describe what that marriage actually looked like from the inside, double life and all, rather than let the fairy tale version stand as the only story anyone remembered. Not everyone in Elvis's life became known for revealing secrets, though. Some people stayed close simply by staying honest, quietly, for years, without ever needing a book deal or a memoir to do it. Jerry Schilling met Elvis on a football field in North Memphis back in 1954. Schilling was 12 years old. Elvis was still a teenager nobody outside Memphis had heard of yet. That friendship lasted from the mid-50s all the way to Elvis's death in 1977. More than 2 decades of closeness that started long before any of the fame, the pressure, or the pills. George Klein, another lifelong friend who met Elvis in high school in the late 40s, once explained exactly why Schilling's presence in Elvis's life mattered so much. "Jerry has an insight a lot of people don't have," Klein said. "He was one of the few guys who would tell Elvis the truth. I think he has a different angle because he had a lot of quality time with Elvis, and Elvis respected his opinion on a lot of stuff. Someone who would actually tell Elvis the truth. That idea stands out against nearly everything else in this story. Because so much of what went wrong around Elvis in his final years came from people who wouldn't push back, who enabled him instead of challenging him, who kept the pills flowing and the secrets buried, simply because it was easier than confronting the most famous entertainer on the planet. Having even one person in that circle willing to be honest with him mattered, maybe more than anyone realized at the time. But by the summer of his final year, even honesty wasn't enough to slow down what was already happening behind the walls of Graceland. The last summer, by the summer of 1977, the people living closest to Elvis weren't watching a rock star anymore. They were watching a man quietly falling apart. Elvis had a live-in nurse by then, a woman named Letitia Henley, brought in specifically to manage his declining health. In her own memoir, written years later, she didn't describe a superstar. She described someone deeply lonely. "He was miserable," she wrote. "He was depressed about aging and not having a woman he loved. Friends kept introducing him to young women, hoping it might lift his spirits." Henley recalled that none of it worked. Elvis had nothing real in common with any of them. What he actually missed, according to the person taking care of him, was Priscilla, a marriage that had already ended years before. His hairstylist, Larry Geller, who spent countless hours alone with him getting ready before shows, noticed something else developing underneath all of it. Elvis knew there was something terribly wrong with his body, Geller said. Something more than the colon, the liver, the medication. Even Elvis himself, according to the people closest to him, seemed to sense something deeper was happening, something none of the individual diagnoses fully explained. His final months were brutal on his body. He was touring constantly, even as he was visibly failing, spending well over 100 days on the road in little more than a year, plus additional runs in Las Vegas and Lake Tahoe stacked on top of that. Concert reviewers who once wrote about his energy, his voice, the way he owned a stage without trying, were now writing about something else entirely: his weight, his visibly exhausted performances. One reporter in Miami described an over-the-hill, overweight idol going through the motions on stage. Another, covering a show in Charlotte, still praised his effort, but couldn't ignore what his body now looked like after years of pills, poor sleep, and comfort food. In his very last days, people who were there said he still tried holding on to small, normal pleasures. Late-night piano sessions, racquetball games with his friend Billy at 4 in the morning, an odd hour that had simply become his new normal after years of sleeping through daylight and living at night instead. By then, he was taking in thousands of pills, vials, and injections across just the final 7 months of his life. Friends said the medication made him difficult to understand on stage during some performances. Getting out of bed some mornings had become its own private struggle. On the morning of August 16th, Elvis walked into the bathroom of his master suite at Graceland. His girlfriend at the time, Ginger Alden, was the one who found him. In her own memoir published decades later, she described the moment in painful detail. His arms lay on the ground, close to his sides, palms facing upward, she wrote. It was clear that, from the moment he landed on the floor, Elvis hadn't moved. He was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. His father, Vernon, was there, and according to accounts from the day, begged his son not to go, as efforts were made to revive him. Elvis was pronounced dead, 42 years old. The news reached his friends in scattered ordinary moments, the way tragic news usually does. A musician and producer who'd worked closely with Elvis for years was on vacation in Hawaii, standing in line at a general store, when he overheard someone say Presley had died. He didn't believe it at first. He grabbed his things, ran to his car, and turned on the radio. The announcer confirmed it plainly. Elvis Presley died this morning. Putnam later described sitting alone in his car afterward, crying, he said, like a child who had a toy taken away from him. Decades later, at the 40th anniversary of Elvis's death, many of the people who had actually known him were still carrying more than grief. They were carrying regret, a quiet sense that they had watched someone they cared about slowly disappearing in front of them for years and hadn't found a way to stop it in time. None of the people who eventually spoke about Elvis's private struggles did it for the same reason or at the same moment. Dr. Nick spent decades defending his own choices. Red West and Sonny West broke their silence almost immediately, driven by a mix of genuine concern and real personal hurt. Priscilla waited far longer, choosing to speak candidly only once enough time had passed that she could describe it without it feeling like an attack on a man she still loved. What connects all of it is the same basic truth. The Elvis the world watched on stage, under the lights, chasing that unmistakable voice through packed arenas, was only ever part of the story. Behind him were people who saw the other part too, the sleepless nights, the pills that kept multiplying, the letters in a Palm Springs mailbox, a manuscript he read alone for 6 months before anyone else ever saw a single page of it. They didn't all agree on what it meant, or on whether they should have said anything at all, but together their accounts are the closest thing we have to understanding who Elvis Presley really was behind the legend, a man who gave the world everything he had on stage, while quietly carrying a weight almost none of his fans ever knew was there. That's the real story behind the man on the poster. Not just the voice, the jumpsuit, the arenas full of screaming fans. A man shaped by early loss, managed by someone hiding his own debts, surrounded by people who loved him but couldn't always help him in time. It took decades for the people closest to him to finally say what they'd seen,